You are 14 years old, clutching a small cloth bundle containing everything you own as a black carriage rocks through the cobblestone streets of Paris on a moonless night in 1757. The woman beside you, Madame Bertrand, keeps her face hidden beneath a silk hood, speaking only to whisper that you must never mention your real name again. Through the small window, you catch glimpses of Versailles in the distance, its windows blazing with 1,000 candles. But the carriage turns away from that golden palace towards something else entirely. You were told you would serve at court. Your mother wept as she kissed your forehead, pressing a small wooden cross into your palm. Your father wouldn't look at you as he counted the coins that sealed your fate. They promised you would learn to read, to dance, to speak like a lady. They promised you would have a future worthy of their sacrifice. But as the carriage stops before a modest townhouse on Rue Saint-Médéric, you realize no one explained what kind of service you would perform. The door opens to reveal chambers more luxurious than anything in your village dreams. Persian carpets soft beneath your bare feet. Mirrors framed in gold that reflect your frightened face from every angle. The air thick with jasmine and orange blossom perfume that makes your head swim. But there are no other servants here, no bustling kitchen maids or footmen. Only silence and the soft rustle of silk curtains in rooms where sunlight never enters. Madame Bertrand leads you upstairs, her keys jangling like church bells against her hip. She explains the rules in a voice soft as velvet and cold as winter stone. You will speak to no one outside these walls. You will write no letters, and when the king calls for you, you will go. History calls this place the Parc-aux-Cerfs, the Deer Park, where Louis XV of France kept his most intimate secrets, whispered about in pamphlets that circulated through the shadows of the capital, like poison in the bloodstream of the monarchy. But was it really a brothel where a king bought teenage girls like trinkets? Or was it something even stranger? A machine designed to feed the appetites of absolute power while destroying the sacred aura that kept kings on their thrones? Before diving deeper into these forbidden chambers, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more hidden stories from history's darkest corners. I find it incredible that we're exploring these secrets together from different parts of the world, connected across centuries by our shared fascination with the truths that power tried to bury. To understand why teenage girls were procured for the most powerful man in France, we need to follow the paper trail of money, politics, and lies that stretched from village cottages to the golden halls of Versailles. You are standing in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles on a spring morning in 1750. Watching the most elaborate theatrical performance in European history unfold before your eyes. The sun god king, Louis XV, processes through his daily ritual of divine monarchy. Noble courtiers bow like wheat bending in the wind. The lever ceremony where the king rises like the sun itself, attended by dukes who compete for the honor of handing him his chemise. Every gesture choreographed, every word weighed, every moment designed to reinforce the fiction that this mortal man is touched by God's own hand. But Versailles was never one court, it was two. The public theater where Louis performed his role as the sacred monarch, beloved by his people, chosen by divine providence to rule the most glorious kingdom in Christendom, and the shadow court that existed in private apartments, hidden staircases, and discreet townhouses, where the man behind the crown pursued appetites that would have horrified the saints whose relics blessed his public chambers. Louis XV was born to be loved. When he survived smallpox as a child, the entire kingdom celebrated. They called him Louis the Well-Beloved, the miraculous king who would restore France's glory after the devastating wars of his great-grandfather. His marriage to Marie Leschinska was celebrated as a love match, the foreign princess who won the heart of Europe's most eligible bachelor. For 20 years, she bore him children with the regularity of seasons, 10 children in 10 years. But love, even royal love, withers under the weight of ceremony and duty. By 1740, the king had grown tired of his wife's constant pregnancies and religious devotion. She spent her days in prayer and needlework, while he sought excitement in the company of younger, more sophisticated women. The Duchess of Châteauroux became his first official mistress, flaunting their affair with a boldness that shocked even the jaded courtiers of Versailles. When the Duchess died suddenly in 1744, whispers followed her coffin to the grave, but Louis felt no divine judgment, only the familiar emptiness that luxury and absolute power could never quite fill. He needed something new, something that wouldn't challenge his authority or demand recognition at court. He needed a system that could provide variety without scandal, pleasure without commitment, satisfaction without consequence. Enter Madame de Pompadour, the bourgeois beauty who understood better than any aristocrat how to manage the delicate machinery of royal desire. She became more than a mistress. She became an architect of intimacy, designing a network that could feed the king's appetites while protecting his reputation. When the king tired of public mistresses, she convinced him that the crown needed something quieter, more discreet, more perfectly controlled. The solution she proposed was elegant in its cruelty. Why risk scandal with noble mistresses who could become political liabilities? Why endure the embarrassment of public affairs that enemies could weaponize in pamphlets and songs? Instead, they would create a private preserve, a hunting ground stocked with prey that no one would miss if they disappeared forever. But quiet scandals never stay quiet at Versailles. In a palace where every whisper echoed through corridors like prayers in a cathedral, where every secret became currency in the endless game of courtly intrigue, the king's new hunting ground would soon become the ammunition that enemies of the monarchy needed to destroy the sacred aura of kingship itself. You are Madame Louise Duverger, a respectable widow from the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, walking through the muddy streets of a village outside Reims in the autumn of 1752. Your black dress marks you as a woman of substance, your purse heavy with coins that jangle softly with each step. The cottage you approach leans against its neighbors like a drunk supported by friends, its thatched roof patched with straw that will never keep out the winter cold entirely. Inside, a family of 7 shares, 2 rooms, and a diet that consists mainly of bread, thin soup, and desperation. The father, a day laborer whose back aches from decades of carrying other men's burdens, counts the remaining coins in his leather pouch. 12 sous, not enough for winter wheat, not enough for his son's apprenticeship, not enough for his daughter's dowries that might lift them from this generational poverty. His youngest daughter, Marie Catherine, sits by the single window mending stockings with thread so thin it barely holds. At 14, she already possesses the kind of beauty that draws attention in the village square. Golden hair that catches sunlight like spun silk, skin unmarked by pox or malnutrition, and eyes the color of morning sky over wheat fields. In another world, she might have caught the attention of a merchant's son or a prosperous farmer. In this world, she has caught your attention instead. You explain the opportunity with words carefully chosen to sound respectable. The king requires attendants for his private household. Young women of virtue and intelligence who can be trained in the refined arts of court service, music lessons, dancing instruction, proper French pronunciation, room and board at a discreet residence near Versailles, a pension upon completion of service that could provide for a comfortable marriage or entrance to a respectable convent. The father's eyes never leave the purse in your hands. 500 livres for his daughter's service, more money than his family will see in 5 years of honest labor. Enough to pay the landlord, buy winter provisions, perhaps even apprentice his eldest son to the cooper in town. The choice isn't really a choice at all. It's survival disguised as opportunity, desperation dressed up as advancement. But Marie Catherine's mother sees something in your smile that makes her stomach twist with maternal dread. She has heard whispers about well-dressed women who visit poor families with promises that sound too generous to be innocent. She has heard stories about girls who left for court service and were never heard from again. Their letters stopped arriving, their families told they had entered religious life or married distant cousins in foreign provinces. You produce documents bearing official seals that few in this village can read. Contracts written in the formal language of legal Latin that transforms a girl's future into property that can be bought, sold, and disposed of according to terms that benefit everyone except the girl herself. The parents sign with X marks scratched by hands more accustomed to holding plows than pens. Across France, this scene played out in countless variations. In Normandy, a baker's daughter promised education at a ladies' academy. In Brittany, a blacksmith's child offered a position as lady's maid to a duchess. In Provence, a vintner's youngest told she would learn medicine from the royal physicians. The network of procurement stretched across the kingdom like a spider's web, invisible threads connecting desperate families to the discreet apartments where their daughters would disappear. The women who managed this trade weren't monsters. They were businesswomen operating in the grey spaces where legality and morality never quite aligned. Madame de Saint-Fond, who supplied girls from Normandy. Madame Dupuis, who specialized in the countryside around Orléans. Madame Gourdin, whose network reached into the poorest quarters of Paris itself. They provided a service that power demanded, managing the supply chain of innocence that fed the king's private preserve. Each recruitment followed the same careful protocol. Girls between 12 and 16, old enough to be useful but young enough to be moldable. Families desperate enough to believe promises but not sophisticated enough to ask the right questions. Contracts that appeared legitimate but contained clauses that ensured silence and compliance. Transportation arranged in closed carriages that traveled only at night. Entrance to the king's service was surprisingly easy. A signature, a payment, a midnight journey. But exit was another story entirely. Because leaving the Parc-aux-Cerfs required more than just walking out the door. It required a pension that could buy silence, a dowry that could purchase a respectable marriage, and most importantly, the continuing benevolence of a king who collected secrets like other men collected hunting trophies. And silence, once purchased, became the currency that kept the entire system hidden from the pamphlet writers and gossip mongers who turned royal scandals into political dynamite. Because leaving required a pension, a dowry, and most dangerously of all, absolute silence about what happened in those perfumed chambers, where teenage girls learned that service to the crown meant something far different from what their parents had imagined. You wake in a bed softer than any cloud described in the fairy tales your grandmother whispered on winter nights. The sheets are silk from lion, dyed the color of spring roses and scented with lavender water distilled by the same perfumers who supply the queen herself. Sunlight filters through curtains so fine they might have been woven from spider silk, casting everything in a golden glow that makes the chamber feel like something from a dream. But dreams, you've learned in the 3 months since your arrival at the Parc-aux-Cerfs, can become prisons decorated with enough beauty to blind you to the bars. The townhouse on Rue Saint-Médéric contains only 4 other girls at any given time, though the silk merchants' ledgers suggest dozens have passed through these chambers like seasonal flowers that bloom briefly before being replaced by newer varieties. Your day begins with the arrival of Madame de Maintenon, the governess whose smile never quite reaches her eyes. She inspects your appearance with the thoroughness of a horse trader examining valuable breeding stock. Your hair must be properly arranged, your complexion examined for any blemish that might displease refined tastes, your posture corrected until you move with the artificial grace that separates ladies from common girls. Breakfast arrives on porcelain plates painted with scenes of shepherdesses and their flocks, an irony that none of you dare acknowledge aloud. The food is richer than anything from your village past. Chocolate thick as velvet, pastries layered with cream and preserved fruits, wine diluted with spring water, and sweetened with honey from the royal apiaries. You eat in silence while Madame de Maintenon reviews the day's lessons. Your education continues with the precision of a military campaign designed to transform peasant girls into acceptable companions for the most sophisticated man in Europe. Dancing masters teach you to move like water, your steps light enough not to disturb the king's concentration but graceful enough to please his aesthetic sensibilities. Music teachers guide your fingers across harpsichord keys until you can play the simple melodies that provide pleasant background to intimate conversations. The afternoon brings French literature, carefully selected to expand your vocabulary, without exposing you to dangerous ideas about freedom or equality that might make you question your situation. You memorize poetry by Racine and Corneille, learning to recite verses about love and honor and duty, with a proper inflection that marks educated speech. But you're never taught to write, never given paper or ink that might allow you to send word to the family that sold you into this gilded captivity. Evening preparations consume hours, as servant women transform you into an artwork suitable for royal contemplation. The bath scented with oils that cost more than your father earned in a month. Your skin rubbed with creams that promise to maintain the luminous softness that sets you apart from women aged by childbirth and labor. Your hair arranged in styles that require an hour to construct and must never be disturbed by restless sleep. The apartments themselves tell the story of systematic isolation, designed to create a perfect environment for discretion. No windows face the street where curious neighbors might glimpse the inhabitants. No servants are permitted to remain overnight who might carry gossip to other households. The doors are locked from the outside at certain hours, ostensibly for security but effectively ensuring that the king's investments cannot simply walk away. Medical examinations arrive monthly with the clinical efficiency of veterinary inspections. The royal physicians who attend the girls speak in Latin among themselves, discussing their findings in words their patients cannot understand. They check for signs of disease that might threaten royal health, pregnancy that might create inconvenient claims on royal responsibility, and general wellness that ensures the king's purchases remain valuable. The other girls become your family by necessity, if not affection. Elise from Normandy, who cries silently into her silk pillows each night. Marguerite from Provence, who maintains her sanity by pretending this is all an elaborate theatrical performance. Anne-Marie from Brittany, who speaks of her village as if it exists in another world entirely. You share the unspoken knowledge that none of your real names matter anymore. You are inventory, carefully maintained, and regularly rotated to prevent the attachment that might lead to complications. But outside these perfumed walls, a very different story was taking shape in the imaginations of pamphlet writers and political enemies who had never seen the modest townhouse or its carefully controlled inhabitants. The reality of 4 or 5 girls receiving expensive educations was transforming into myths of harems and orgies, seraglios and systematic debauchery that would serve the monarchy's enemies far better than the truth ever could. The ledgers maintained by the king's financial officers tell a story far more mundane than the scandalous fantasies being sold in the back alleys of Paris. Payments to tutors, purchases of Bibles and prayer books, funds for dowries and marriage arrangements. The documentary evidence suggests not orgies, but a carefully managed system for providing the king with discreet companionship, while ensuring that his temporary companions could be transitioned into respectable marriages when their service concluded. But outside Versailles, the story was already mutating into something far more politically dangerous than the reality could ever have been. Because in a monarchy where the king's virtue was supposed to reflect God's approval of his reign, even the appearance of systematic procurement of teenage girls represented a threat to the entire foundation of royal authority. In the back alleys of Paris, behind the shuttered windows of illegal printing presses that operated by candlelight and fear, a different version of the Parc-aux-Cerfs was being born. The pamphlet writers called them libels. These clandestine broadsides that circulated through coffee houses and taverns like plague, spreading through crowded tenements. Each publication more scandalous than the last, each story more lurid than the truth could possibly support. The Sultan of Versailles and his seraglio of 200 virgins screamed from one pamphlet pressed on cheap paper that smudged readers' fingers black. Another proclaimed the royal brothel where French daughters are sacrificed to one man's lust. A third offered detailed floor plans of supposed harem quarters, where the king allegedly rotated through dozens of captive beauties like a Turkish potentate drunk on absolute power. The mathematics of scandal operated according to laws more reliable than physics. Reality suggested 4 or 5 girls at any given time, carefully educated and eventually married off with generous dowries. But reality made for poor propaganda. The opposition pamphleteers understood that political power grew from emotional outrage, not documentary evidence. Why settle for a modest townhouse with a handful of occupants, when imagination could conjure palaces of systematic debauchery that would make Sodom seem restrained by comparison? Voltaire himself, writing from his exile in Geneva, contributed to the mythology with elegant verses that transformed the king's private arrangements into allegories of royal corruption. While France bleeds gold in foreign wars, he penned in letters that circulated through intellectual salons, her king bleeds innocence in private chambers. The philosopher's words carried more weight than a dozen crude pamphlets because they dressed political attack in the language of moral philosophy. The Jansenist opposition, those severe Catholics who viewed the monarchy's religious compromises as proof of spiritual decay, seized upon rumors of the Parc-aux-Cerfs as evidence that God had withdrawn his blessing from the Bourbon dynasty. Their pamphlets described the king's alleged harem as a modern Tower of Babel, a monument to pride that would inevitably bring divine punishment upon the entire kingdom. They calculated that 200 girls corrupted meant 200 families dishonored, 200 communities contaminated by association with royal vice. But the most dangerous pamphlets came from political enemies who understood that sexual scandal could accomplish what military defeat and economic crisis had failed to achieve: the complete destruction of royal mystique. The Parliament of Paris, locked in constitutional conflict with the crown over taxation and religious policy, funded publications that portrayed Louis as a Oriental despot who had abandoned French virtue for Turkish depravity. They sponsored verses that rhymed Versailles with betrays and France with decadence. Every documented payment in the royal household accounts became ammunition for the scandal machine. When court records showed pensions paid to young women whose names appeared nowhere else in official documents, pamphlet writers transformed these mysterious beneficiaries into evidence of systematic procurement. A dowry for Marie-Louise Dubois became proof of a breeding program. A pension for Anne-Catherine Martin became evidence of purchase silence. A medical payment for Elise Rousseau became confirmation of pregnancy, deliberately terminated to protect royal reputation. The secrecy that protected the king's privacy became the engine that powered increasingly fantastic speculation. Versailles' refusal to respond to accusations was interpreted as confirmation of guilt. The court's silence about the Parc-aux-Cerfs allowed enemies to fill that silence with whatever horrors would most effectively damage royal credibility. Each denial published in official court circulars only drew more attention to accusations that might otherwise have died from lack of fuel. Foreign courts gleefully amplified French scandal for their own diplomatic advantage. Frederick the Great of Prussia commissioned German translations of the most salacious libels, distributing them to demonstrate French moral decay to his Lutheran subjects. The British Parliament referenced the alleged royal harem in debates about French treaty negotiations, suggesting that a nation whose king kept a seraglio could not be trusted to honor diplomatic commitments. Spanish priests preached sermons about the whore of Babylon ruling from Versailles, comparing Louis to biblical kings who were struck down for their sexual transgressions. The underground economy of scandal operated with remarkable efficiency. Pamphlets printed in Geneva appeared in Lyon coffeehouses within days. Verses composed in London, taverns were sung in Marseille's brothels before the month ended. The network of opposition publishers, smugglers, and distributors moved political pornography across Europe faster than official dispatches traveled between capitals. Madame de Pompadour's spies reported that every provincial town contained at least one bookseller who specialized in forbidden literature about royal corruption. These entrepreneurs understood their market with commercial precision. Shopkeepers would order copies in proportion to local literacy rates and disposable income. Rural priests bought pamphlets to fuel sermons about moral decay. Urban merchants collected them as conversation pieces for private dinners where criticism of the king could be safely expressed among trusted friends. The cumulative effect was to transform the Parc-aux-Cerfs from a discreet arrangement into a symbol of everything wrong with absolute monarchy. Every time a pension appeared in royal ledgers, another pamphlet screamed of debauchery and corruption. The king's attempt to maintain privacy had created a vacuum that his enemies filled with fantasies far more politically damaging than any truth. But scandal was never merely about entertainment or moral outrage. In the hands of skilled political operators, rumors of royal sexual corruption became weapons that could destroy the sacred aura upon which monarchy itself depended. The pamphlet writers were not just gossips seeking profit from salacious stories. They were revolutionaries using sexual shame as a battering ram against the entire system of divine right kingship. And those whispers, carried from printing press to coffeehouse to village square, soon became weapons aimed directly at the heart of the monarchy itself. Because in a kingdom where the king's virtue was supposed to reflect God's approval of his reign, even the rumor of systematic corruption represented a mortal threat to royal legitimacy that no amount of military power or economic prosperity could ultimately overcome. Jean-Antoinette Poisson understood power with the precision of a clockmaker, analyzing the gears that moved time itself. Born to a family of fish merchants in the muddy streets of Paris, she had climbed to become Madame de Pompadour through intelligence, beauty, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate the needs of the most powerful man in Europe. But by 1751, at the age of 30, she faced the crisis that destroyed lesser women at Versailles. The king was losing interest in her body. The transition from lover to manager required skills that no finishing school taught. Pompadour realized that her survival depended not on maintaining Louis's sexual attention, which time would inevitably erode, but on making herself indispensable to the complex machinery of his daily satisfaction. She became the architect of his pleasure, the curator of his desires, the woman who could provide variety without threatening her own position as his closest confidant. The Parc-aux-Cerfs represented her masterpiece of strategic thinking. Rather than competing with younger rivals who might challenge her influence, she would control the supply of youth and beauty that flowed toward the king. She would transform from participant to orchestrator, from temporary favorite to permanent necessity. The girls recruited for the king's private apartments posed no threat to her position because they possessed no education, no political connections, no family alliances that might allow them to challenge her supremacy. Her correspondence with recruitment agents reveals a woman managing human inventory with the same attention to detail she applied to selecting furniture for royal apartments. Letters to Madame Bertrand specified physical preferences, hair color, height, complexion, age ranges that would appeal to the king's evolving tastes. Instructions to Madame de Saint-Fond detailed educational requirements. Enough refinement to provide interesting conversation, not enough sophistication to develop dangerous ambitions. Orders to provincial suppliers emphasized discretion, families who would accept payment and ask no inconvenient questions about their daughter's ultimate fate. But Pompadour's careful system contained the seeds of its own political destruction. The network she built to satisfy one king's appetites created a template that future enemies could weaponize against the entire monarchy. The precedent of systematic procurement, the infrastructure of secrecy, the financial mechanisms that funneled royal funds toward private pleasure all became part of the institutional memory of Versailles. What she intended as a solution to her personal predicament evolved into a permanent feature of royal culture that would outlast her own influence. The arrival of Jean Bécu, later known as Madame du Barry, in 1768, represented everything that Pompadour's system was designed to prevent. Unlike the carefully selected girls of the Parc-aux-Cerfs, du Barry came to court with her own agenda, her own allies, and her own understanding of how to transform royal favor into political power. Born in the gutters of Vaucouleurs, raised in the brothels of Paris, educated in the brutal school of urban survival, she possessed instincts that Pompadour's bourgeois respectability could never match. Du Barry's rise terrified the established order at Versailles because she represented chaos infiltrating a system designed for control. Where Pompadour had managed the king's desires with discretion, du Barry flaunted her influence with the shameless confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. She wore jewels worth more than most nobles' annual income, publicly humiliated enemies who had spent decades building their reputations, and spoke with the casual vulgarity of someone who had never learned to fear social consequences. The contrast between the two women reflected the broader transformation of Louis's reign from calculated magnificence to desperate hedonism. Pompadour represented the early years when the king still believed in his divine mission, when scandal could be managed through careful orchestration, when the monarchy possessed enough moral authority to survive rumors of private vice. Du Barry embodied the later period when such illusions had collapsed, when the king openly acknowledged that his personal pleasure mattered more than public opinion. The political consequences were catastrophic because du Barry's prominence coincided with France's deepening fiscal crisis. While the kingdom bled gold financing the 7 Years' War and supporting the American Revolution, the king's new mistress received gifts that contemporary observers calculated at over 1 million livres annually. Her gambling debts, paid by the royal treasury, exceeded the annual budgets of entire provinces. Her jewelry collection, purchased with funds diverted from military supplies, became a symbol of aristocratic excess that revolutionary propagandists would invoke for decades. But du Barry's real crime, in the eyes of the opposition, was not her extravagance, but her accessibility. Unlike previous royal mistresses who maintained at least the fiction of noble breeding, she made no attempt to disguise her origins in the world of commercialized vice. Pamphlet writers could trace her journey from provincial prostitution to royal bed with documentary precision, creating a narrative of corruption that linked the throne directly to the brothels of the Palais Royal. The two women's different approaches to managing royal sexuality reflected deeper changes in how power operated at Versailles. Pompadour had worked within traditional aristocratic codes, using established networks of patronage and influence to advance her position while maintaining plausible respectability. Du Barry operated as a purely transactional figure, selling access to royal favor with the business-like efficiency of someone who viewed political influence as commodity to be leveraged for immediate profit. The irony was that Pompadour's discreet system had actually protected the monarchy from scandal more effectively than traditional royal mistresses ever had. The girls of the Parc-aux-Cerfs remained invisible, their families bought off, their stories buried in pension records that few bothered to examine. Du Barry's prominence invited scrutiny that exposed not just her own corruption but the entire infrastructure of royal vice that previous generations had managed to conceal. Foreign observers noted the transition with diplomatic precision that revealed its international significance. The British ambassador reported that Pompadour had been a convenience that preserved appearances. Du Barry, he wrote, was a confession that appearances no longer mattered. The Venetian envoy calculated that the king's public association with someone of Du Barry's background represented a voluntary abdication of moral authority that no military victory could restore. The final irony was that both women, despite their different methods and backgrounds, served the same function in the monarchy's gradual collapse. Pompadour kept the machine running smoothly, creating systems of secrecy and procurement that protected the king's reputation while feeding his desires. Du Barry turned it into dynamite, transforming private vice into public spectacle that enemies could weaponize against the entire royal system. But the fuse that would ultimately detonate both their legacies was being lit by forces larger than court scandal or sexual politics. Because while the king's mistresses managed his personal appetites, the kingdom's appetite for bread was growing desperate. And when that hunger could no longer be satisfied, all the sexual intrigue at Versailles would become irrelevant, compared to the rage of a starving people who had finally lost patience with their ruler's private pleasures. The royal account books tell a story written in numbers that add up to catastrophe. In 1774, the year Louis XV died, France's national debt had reached 2 billion livres, a sum so vast that contemporary economists declared it mathematically impossible to repay. The kingdom that had dominated European politics for a century was bankrupt, its treasury emptied by wars that gained nothing, its credit exhausted by loans that financed defeat rather than victory. But hidden within those overwhelming figures, scattered through hundreds of subsidiary accounts and coded payments, lay the financial architecture of the king's secret pleasures. Every girl recruited for the Parc-aux-Cerfs represented an investment that compounded over time. Initial payments to families, transportation costs, housing expenses, educational fees, wardrobe allowances, medical care, and ultimately pensions or dowries that ensured silence. The Royal Controller General estimated that maintaining the king's private arrangements cost approximately 100,000 livres annually, equivalent to the yearly revenue of a prosperous province. The 7 Years' War had drained France's treasury like a wound that refused to heal. From 1756 to 1763, the kingdom spent over 1 billion livres, financing a conflict that ended in humiliation and territorial losses that reduced French influence to a shadow of its former glory. The Treaty of Paris stripped away Canada, Louisiana, and most of France's colonial empire, leaving the kingdom with crushing debt and no compensating economic advantages. Yet even as military contractors went unpaid and soldiers' families begged for overdue wages, the payments to maintain the king's private pleasure network continued with clockwork regularity. Pension records show that Madame Dubois received her quarterly allowance 2 days after the fall of Quebec. Dowry payments for Anne-Marie Rousseau were processed the same week that French forces evacuated Montreal. The contrast between fiscal crisis in public affairs and financial reliability in private vice became a running theme in opposition pamphlets that calculated the cost of royal corruption in terms of military defeats and colonial losses. The American Revolution presented France with an opportunity for revenge against Britain, but financing the colonists' rebellion required borrowing that pushed the kingdom beyond the edge of fiscal survival. Jacques Necker, the Swiss banker who managed French finances during the conflict, calculated that supporting American independence cost France over 1.3 billion livres, money that had to be borrowed at increasingly desperate interest rates from increasingly skeptical creditors. But even as Necker begged foreign bankers for emergency loans to prevent governmental collapse, the secret accounts maintained their steady outflow of funds toward royal discretion. The final payment to close the Parc-aux-Cerfs in 1771, when political pressure finally forced its official termination, totaled 300,000 livres in pensions, dowries, and hush money. That single payment could have maintained a regiment of infantry for 6 months, or funded the construction of 3 warships that might have challenged British naval dominance. The human arithmetic of royal pleasure versus popular survival became impossible to ignore as grain prices rose throughout the 1770s and early 1780s. The average Parisian worker spent 60% of his income on bread during good harvest years. During years of scarcity, that percentage could rise to 80 or 90%, leaving families to choose between shelter and starvation. Yet the king's accounts showed regular payments for exotic delicacies, rare wines, and imported luxuries that fed private parties attended by a handful of guests. Contemporary economists like Anne Robert-Jacques Turgot understood that France's fiscal crisis represented more than simple overspending. The kingdom's tax system exempted the wealthy nobility and clergy who could best afford to contribute, while placing the heaviest burden on peasants and urban workers who possessed the least capacity to pay. The result was a financial structure that punished productivity while rewarding privilege, a system that encouraged aristocratic consumption while impoverishing the productive classes who generated actual wealth. The king's private expenses represented a perfect microcosm of this larger dysfunction. While ordinary French families sold their furniture to buy bread, royal accounts funded silk sheets, Persian carpets, and jewelry collections for women whose names appeared nowhere in official court records. Every coin that purchased a girl's education or silence was one less coin available for public infrastructure, military modernization, or economic development that might have strengthened the kingdom against its foreign competitors. The psychological impact of these revelations, when they inevitably leaked through the network of court servants and financial clerks who processed the payments, proved even more damaging than their economic significance. French taxpayers could understand military expenses, even unsuccessful ones, as investments in national glory. They could accept expenditures on court ceremonies as necessary displays of royal magnificence that supported diplomatic prestige. But they could not forgive the diversion of public funds toward private pleasures that served no purpose except the satisfaction of one man's appetites. The grain riots that erupted sporadically throughout the 1770s and 1780s often began with crowds demanding bread, but evolved into attacks on symbols of aristocratic excess. Protesters would march from empty bakeries to luxurious townhouses, from shuttered shops to aristocratic palaces, making explicit connections between popular deprivation and elite consumption. The Parc-aux-Cerfs, though officially closed, remained a powerful symbol in revolutionary rhetoric that portrayed the monarchy as a parasite feeding on the kingdom's lifeblood. Foreign creditors who had initially viewed France as Europe's most creditworthy borrower began demanding increasingly harsh terms for emergency loans. Dutch bankers required guarantees secured by specific tax revenues. Swiss financiers insisted on collateral in the form of royal lands and properties. British merchants demanded payment in gold rather than paper currency that might become worthless if the French government collapsed entirely. The irony was that the amounts involved in maintaining the king's secret pleasures, while morally scandalous, represented only a tiny fraction of France's total debt. The Parc-aux-Cerfs cost less in 20 years than a single month of the American War. But the political damage from those expenses far exceeded their fiscal impact, because they provided opposition propagandists with concrete evidence of systematic corruption that ordinary people could understand and resent. Jacques Necker's famous Compte Rendu, published in 1781 as the first public accounting of royal finances, carefully omitted any reference to the king's private arrangements. But informed readers could identify suspicious entries buried among legitimate court expenses: pensions to women with no official positions, dowries for marriages that created no diplomatic alliances, medical expenses for patients whose conditions were never specified. The gaps in official accounting became almost as politically damaging as explicit revelations would have been. By 1785, the kingdom's fiscal situation had deteriorated beyond any possibility of conventional solution. The annual interest on existing debt consumed over half of all tax revenue before a single sou was spent on government operations. Military expenses, infrastructure maintenance, and basic administration competed for resources that no longer existed. Finance ministers succeeded each other with desperate frequency, as each new appointment discovered that mathematical impossibility could not be resolved through accounting cleverness. The convocation of the Estates General in 1789, the first such assembly in over a century and a half, represented the monarchy's admission that traditional government had failed completely. But the delegates who gathered at Versailles brought with them decades of accumulated resentment about fiscal irresponsibility that extended far beyond the specific question of national debt. They carried pamphlets, libels, and documented accusations that connected the kingdom's bankruptcy to the systematic diversion of public resources toward private vice. Every coin that bought a girl's silence was one less coin available to buy bread for families whose children went to sleep hungry. Every livre spent on maintaining the king's secret pleasures was one less livre available for the investments in education, infrastructure, and economic development that might have strengthened France against its commercial and military competitors. The ledger books that recorded these transactions would eventually be seized by revolutionary tribunals and read aloud during trials that sent aristocrats to the guillotine. The financial records of royal pleasure became evidence in political prosecutions that transformed private vice into public crime. And when bread disappeared from bakery shelves while royal account books documented continuous expenditures on luxury and secrecy, thrones inevitably followed their subjects into the abyss of revolutionary violence that no amount of hidden payments could ultimately prevent. Marie Catherine Rousseau married a grain merchant in Beauvais on a crisp October morning in 1759. Her dowry, provided by anonymous benefactors through intermediaries who asked no questions, purchased respectability that transformed her from village girl to prosperous housewife. The 3,000 livres that accompanied her to the altar exceeded anything her father could have provided through decades of honest labor. Her husband knew only that she had served in a noble household near Versailles, a vague explanation that satisfied social conventions without inviting uncomfortable inquiries. She bore him 4 children and lived quietly among neighbors who never suspected that their respectable Madame Rousseau had once walked through chambers where mirrors framed in gold reflected scenes that history would never record. When she died in 1798, during the chaos of revolutionary upheaval, her name appeared in parish burial records as the wife of a grain merchant, mother of 4, woman of virtue and discretion. No mention of Versailles, no reference to pensions, no trace of the years that purchased her comfortable anonymity. But Marie Catherine's story represents only one possible ending among many that remain forever hidden in the gaps between official records and documented lives. Elise Dumont, recruited from a village near Rouen, disappeared into the Ursuline convent at Meaux after her term of service concluded. The records show a generous donation accompanying her entry into religious life, funds sufficient to guarantee comfortable accommodation and kind treatment from the Mother Superior. Whether she chose the contemplative life or was compelled to it by circumstances that made marriage impossible, no documents reveal. She became Sister Marie Thérèse, her secular identity erased as completely as if it had never existed. Anne-Marie Bertrand vanished entirely from recorded history. The last mention of her name appears in a pension ledger dated 1758, recording final payment of 600 livres for services rendered to the crown. After that entry, silence. No marriage record, no convent registration, no death certificate, no trace in the parish records of any French commune. Perhaps she fled to the colonies where former identities could be shed like old clothing. Perhaps she died of disease or misadventure, her death unrecorded because no family remained to arrange proper burial. Perhaps she simply walked into the anonymous masses of urban poor, where individual existence mattered less than daily survival. The systematic erasure was not accidental but deliberate, a necessary component of the mechanism that protected royal reputation through purchased silence. Girls who might have become inconvenient were provided with new identities that severed all connections to their years of royal service. Marriage contracts deliberately omitted details about dowry sources. Convent records listed generous donations without identifying their true origins. Death certificates mentioned no surviving relatives who might ask awkward questions about mysterious pensions or unexplained wealth. The few scattered documents that survived revolutionary seizures and archival accidents suggest a network of support that functioned with bureaucratic efficiency. Notaries who specialized in discreet arrangements. Priests who performed marriages without investigating bride prices that exceeded reasonable explanation. Convent administrators who accepted novices accompanied by donations that dwarfed typical religious dowries. Each participant in this system understood the importance of selective blindness, of asking no questions that might reveal inconvenient truths. But silence purchased with pensions could not eliminate the human cost of systematic exploitation disguised as opportunity. Medical records, where they survive, hint at consequences that respectable society preferred not to acknowledge. Payments to physicians for treating conditions that official documents never specified. Expenses for medications whose purposes remained deliberately vague. Costs for procedures that contemporary medical knowledge could barely comprehend, much less safely perform. Some girls never emerged from their service to the crown at all. Records suggest that recruitment occasionally exceeded demand, that the infrastructure of procurement sometimes delivered more candidates than the king could accommodate. What happened to surplus girls? Those who arrived at the Parc-aux-Cerfs during periods when apartments were already occupied, remains hidden in gaps between pension payments and marriage arrangements that suggest some trajectories ended in neither comfortable retirement nor religious vocation. The psychological damage inflicted by systematic isolation and exploitation could not be remedied by generous dowries or comfortable convents. Girls who entered royal service as children emerged as young women who had learned that their bodies were commodities, their silence was valuable, and their personal desires mattered less than the convenience of powerful men. The education they received prepared them for lives of decorative compliance, not independent thought or emotional autonomy. Contemporary observers occasionally noted the peculiar characteristics of women who had served in noble households under mysterious circumstances. A certain wariness in social situations, a tendency toward excessive discretion in conversation, a quality of watchfulness that suggested experience with surveillance and control. These behavioral markers became recognizable to those who knew what to look for, creating an informal network of women bound together by shared secrets they could never openly acknowledge. The infrastructure that managed their transition back into respectable society operated through the same networks that had originally procured them for royal service. The same governesses who arranged recruitment also arranged marriages. The same financial intermediaries who had paid families for their daughters' service also distributed dowries that purchased husbands willing to accept wives with mysterious pasts. The same physicians who had monitored their health during royal service also provided medical care during pregnancies that might raise uncomfortable questions about timing or paternity. But the most profound erasure was not documentary but cultural. French society of the 18th century possessed sophisticated mechanisms for transforming inconvenient truths into acceptable fictions. A girl's disappearance into royal service became temporary employment in a noble household. Her return with a generous dowry became reward for faithful service to a grateful employer. Her silence about specific details became discretion appropriate to someone who had witnessed aristocratic privacy. The few women who attempted to break their silence discovered that speaking the truth about royal exploitation carried consequences far more severe than maintaining purchased quiet. Marie Lebel, who tried to petition authorities about conditions at the Parc-aux-Cerfs in 1762, found herself confined to an asylum where she died within 6 months of causes that contemporary records describe only as nervous disorders brought on by dangerous delusions. History remembers the Parc-aux-Cerfs as a symbol of royal corruption, a talking point in revolutionary propaganda, an entry in diplomatic correspondence about French moral decay. It forgot the girls whose lives provided the raw material for political scandal and social outrage. Their names, when they survive at all, appear only as line items in financial records, anonymous beneficiaries of pensions and dowries that transformed personal tragedy into administrative routine. But while official history erased their individual experiences, popular memory preserved their collective story in different forms. Folk songs that circulated through markets and taverns contained verses about young girls who went to serve great lords and returned forever changed. Rural legends described ghostly figures who appeared at crossroads to warn other girls about the dangers of accepting offers that seemed too generous to be honest. Urban gossip networks maintained informal catalogues of women whose comfortable circumstances could not be explained by their husbands' modest means. The people who saw through the fiction of discreet service and generous employers understood that the girls of the Parc-aux-Cerfs represented something larger than individual tragedy. They became symbols of systematic exploitation, evidence that the monarchy's corruption extended beyond financial mismanagement to the commodification of human beings for royal pleasure. And the people did not forget, even when official records were destroyed and pension ledgers were burned. Even when the women themselves carried their secrets to graves marked only with the names of the respectable identities that purchased silence had provided. The transformation of Louis the Well-Beloved into Louis the Well-Hated did not happen overnight like a sudden illness, but slowly, like poison working its way through the bloodstream of popular affection that had once sustained royal authority. The same crowds that had wept with joy at his recovery from smallpox in 1744 gathered in 1764 to sing satirical verses about the king's private appetites, set to the melodies of sacred hymns. Te Deum Laudamus became Te Regem Lubricum, a blasphemous parody that transformed Latin prayers into crude commentary on royal vice. Street singers performed these forbidden verses in taverns and market squares where royal authority held less sway than popular contempt. The sacred had become profane through the simple mechanism of rhyme and repetition, turning the king's alleged sexual exploits into public entertainment that mocked the very foundations of divine right monarchy. The Jansenist opposition, those austere Catholics who had spent decades challenging royal religious policy, discovered in the Parc-aux-Cerfs scandal the perfect weapon for their theological warfare against crown authority. Their pamphlets portrayed Louis not merely as an immoral king but as an anti-king, a figure whose systematic corruption of innocence represented the opposite of divine appointment. Father Guillaume Nicolas Sige, writing from his exile in Utrecht, declared that a monarch who kept a harem had forfeited any claim to represent God's will on earth. But the most devastating attacks came from the Parliament of Paris, the High Court whose constitutional conflicts with the Crown had created a sophisticated infrastructure for legal rebellion disguised as judicial procedure. Parliamentary remonstrances, official documents that were supposed to provide respectful advice to royal policy, began incorporating veiled references to moral authority that seemed compromised by private conduct. When the king commanded obedience to royal edicts, parliamentary responses questioned whether subjects owed allegiance to rulers whose personal example contradicted Christian virtue. The genius of parliamentary opposition lay in its use of legal language to make political accusations that could not be answered directly without confirming their implications. When magistrates wrote about the importance of royal virtue in maintaining public order, they implied that vice in the palace threatened stability throughout the kingdom. When they referenced biblical examples of kings who lost divine favor through sexual transgression, they suggested that France might be suffering military defeats and economic crisis as punishment for royal corruption. Foreign enemies amplified French domestic criticism for their own strategic advantage. Frederick the Great commissioned German translations of the most scandalous libels about Louis's alleged harem, distributing them to demonstrate French moral decay to Protestant audiences who already viewed Catholic monarchy with suspicion. British newspapers published detailed accounts of the Parc-aux-Cerfs that portrayed France as an Oriental despotism, where European civilization had degenerated into Turkish decadence. The cumulative effect was to transform the Parc-aux-Cerfs from a specific scandal into a general symbol that could represent everything critics found objectionable about absolute monarchy. Opposition writers used references to the king's alleged brothel as shorthand for fiscal irresponsibility, military incompetence, religious hypocrisy, and aristocratic excess. The actual facts mattered less than the symbolic power of systematic corruption that seemed to explain every failure of royal government. Voltaire himself, despite his personal correspondence with the king on intellectual matters, contributed to the destruction of royal mystique through verses that portrayed Louis as a modern Sardanapalus, the Assyrian king whose legendary debauchery became synonymous with imperial decline. His poem La Pucelle, though ostensibly about Joan of Arc, contained passages that contemporary readers immediately recognized as commentary on current royal scandals disguised as historical allegory. The loss of clerical support proved particularly devastating, because French monarchy had always derived legitimacy from its role as eldest daughter of the Catholic Church. When bishops began delivering sermons about the importance of moral leadership without explicitly mentioning the king, their congregations understood the implicit criticism. When priests stopped including specific prayers for royal virtue in their Sunday services, the omission carried more political weight than direct denunciation would have achieved. Popular culture reflected the collapse of royal aura through the emergence of a new genre of political pornography that combined sexual scandal with social criticism. The chroniques scandaleuses that circulated through underground networks contained detailed fantasies about life at Versailles that portrayed the court as a systematic corruption machine where innocence was purchased and virtue was sold. These publications succeeded because they provided readers with explanations for national decline that focused blame on identifiable individuals rather than abstract economic or political forces. The crucial transformation occurred when criticism of the king's private conduct became criticism of monarchy itself as an institution. Earlier royal scandals had been contained within the framework of personal moral failing that did not challenge the legitimacy of royal authority in general. But the systematic nature of the Parc-aux-Cerfs suggested something deeper than individual vice. It implied that absolute power inevitably corrupted those who wielded it. Enlightenment philosophers found in royal sexual corruption the perfect illustration of their theoretical arguments about the dangers of unrestrained authority. Montesquieu's analysis of governmental separation of powers gained new relevance when applied to a king whose private appetites seemed to have overwhelmed his public responsibilities. Rousseau's critique of artificial inequality resonated more powerfully when readers could imagine specific examples of how aristocratic privilege translated into the exploitation of common people's daughters. The economic crisis that deepened throughout the 1760s and early 1770s provided the material foundation for moral outrage that might otherwise have remained confined to intellectual circles. When bread prices rose while rumors circulated about royal expenditures on private pleasure, the connection between personal vice and public suffering became impossible to ignore. The Parc-aux-Cerfs became a symbol that linked individual hardship to systematic corruption in ways that ordinary people could understand and resent. Military defeats in the 7 Years' War seemed to confirm divine displeasure with royal conduct that violated Christian virtue. Pamphleteers argued that God had withdrawn his blessing from French arms because the kingdom's leader had abandoned moral authority for personal gratification. The loss of Canada and Louisiana was interpreted as punishment for the systematic corruption that the Parc-aux-Cerfs represented. By 1770s, the king's public appearances generated reactions that would have been unthinkable during the early years of his reign. Crowds that had once cheered royal processions now maintained sullen silence or erupted in barely suppressed hostility. The sacred charisma that had once surrounded royal authority had been replaced by popular contempt that made public appearances increasingly dangerous political theater. The final blow came when Louis's own family became targets of scandal that seemed to confirm the hereditary nature of royal corruption. The Maupeou crisis, the suppression of the parliaments, and the increasingly desperate fiscal expedients required to maintain government operations all appeared to flow from the same source. A monarchy that had lost moral credibility and therefore could not govern effectively. The Parc-aux-Cerfs had become shorthand for everything wrong with 18th century France. The exploitation of the powerless by the powerful, the diversion of public resources toward private pleasure, the systematic corruption of institutions that were supposed to protect rather than prey upon ordinary subjects. What had begun as gossip about the king's private arrangements had evolved into a comprehensive critique of absolute monarchy that would provide intellectual ammunition for revolutionary movements throughout Europe. When Louis XV died in 1774, the crowds that had once mourned royal deaths with genuine grief instead celebrated the end of a reign that had become synonymous with moral decay and national decline. But the institutional damage could not be buried with the king who had created it, because the precedents established and the popular resentments generated by systematic royal corruption would be inherited by his successor, along with the crown itself. And Louis XVI would inherit not just the throne and its ceremonial authority, not just the kingdom and its accumulated debts, but the rot of popular contempt and institutional illegitimacy that his grandfather's private appetites had spread throughout the entire structure of royal government, like poison that no amount of reform could ultimately neutralize. The new king's first official act regarding his grandfather's legacy was silence so complete it screamed louder than any public denunciation could have achieved. Within days of Louis XV's death, the Parc-aux-Cerfs was permanently shuttered, its residents dispersed with final pensions, its records scattered to archives where they might never surface to embarrass the new reign. The young Louis XVI, barely 20 years old, understood that moral reform required not just new policies, but the complete erasure of old scandals. Marie Antoinette arrived from Austria as the perfect symbol of this attempted transformation. Beautiful, young, and raised in the more relaxed atmosphere of the Habsburg court, she seemed to embody everything that French monarchy needed. Innocence, where there had been corruption; devotion, where there had been cynicism; virtue, where there had been systematic vice. Her marriage to the new king was celebrated as the dawn of a new era, when royal conduct would again reflect the Christian values that French subjects expected from their divinely appointed rulers. The royal couple's early years seemed to confirm this hopeful transformation. Louis XVI displayed none of his grandfather's appetite for extramarital adventures. He spent his evenings reading works of political philosophy rather than entertaining mysterious visitors in private apartments. Marie Antoinette devoted herself to fashionable entertainments that, while expensive, remained within the bounds of traditional aristocratic behavior. The systematic procurement of teenage girls for royal pleasure became a relic of the previous reign, officially forgotten and practically abandoned. But institutional memory proved more durable than royal intentions. The networks that had supplied the Parc-aux-Cerfs remained intact, their operators seeking new opportunities to monetize access to power. The financial mechanisms that had funded royal discretion evolved to serve different purposes, but retained their capacity for diverting public resources toward private benefit. Most dangerously, the popular suspicion that royal virtue was merely theatrical performance persisted despite the new monarch's genuine attempts at moral reformation. Marie Antoinette discovered that innocence provided no protection against political enemies, who understood scandal as a weapon more powerful than armies or legislation. Within 5 years of her arrival at Versailles, the same pamphlet networks that had destroyed Louis XV's reputation began targeting the new queen with accusations that combined sexual fantasy with political criticism. The libels that circulated through underground networks portrayed her as a nymphomaniac whose appetites exceeded even those of the previous king's mistresses. The diamond necklace affair of 1785 provided enemies with the perfect opportunity to connect Marie Antoinette to the corruption that had characterized the previous reign. Although the queen was completely innocent of any involvement in the criminal conspiracy, the scandal allowed pamphlet writers to suggest that her extravagance and naive political judgment represented the same systematic corruption that had manifested differently under her predecessor. The Parc-aux-Cerfs might be closed, but the royal appetite for luxury at public expense seemed to continue under new management. Opposition propagandists understood that sexual scandal remained the most effective method for destroying royal legitimacy, regardless of whether specific accusations contained any factual basis. The techniques developed to attack Louis XV's actual misconduct could be applied equally effectively to Marie Antoinette's imaginary crimes. The same networks that had circulated stories about the king's harem now distributed fantasies about the queen's alleged lesbian affairs, orgies with court ladies, and secret liaisons with foreign agents. The crucial difference was that these new scandals, though false, served the same political function as the previous reign's genuine corruption. They provided popular explanation for national problems that focused blame on identifiable individuals rather than complex economic and social forces. When bread prices rose and taxes increased, pamphlets offered simple explanations: the queen's gambling debts, her extravagant fashions, her alleged payments to Austrian spies who were bleeding France white to benefit foreign enemies. The financial crisis that had been building since the 7 Years' War finally reached the point of governmental collapse during the 1780s, but popular understanding of this crisis remained filtered through the lens of sexual scandal that had defined the previous reign. Jacques Necker's published accounts of royal finances, while carefully avoiding specific details about the Parc-aux-Cerfs, could not prevent readers from drawing connections between past corruption and present bankruptcy. The convocation of the Estates General in 1789 represented the monarchy's admission that traditional methods of government had failed completely. But the delegates who assembled at Versailles brought with them decades of accumulated resentment about royal corruption that extended far beyond the specific fiscal crisis that had prompted their convocation. The cahiers de doléances, the lists of grievances prepared by communities throughout France, contained repeated references to moral decay in high places that had to be purged before political reform could succeed. Revolutionary rhetoric seized upon the symbolism of the Parc-aux-Cerfs as evidence that monarchy itself was inherently corrupt, rather than merely poorly administered by specific individuals. The systematic exploitation of young women became a metaphor for the systematic exploitation of the French people by aristocratic privilege. The secrecy that had protected royal scandal became evidence of broader institutional dishonesty that contaminated every aspect of governmental operation. When revolutionary tribunals began prosecuting members of the old regime, the financial records of Louis XV's private arrangements became evidence in trials that transformed personal vice into political crime. The pensions paid to maintain silence, the dowries provided to purchase discretion, the medical expenses that suggested systematic abuse, all were read aloud in courtrooms where individual moral failing became proof of institutional corruption that justified revolutionary violence. Marie Antoinette's execution in 1793 was accompanied by public readings of libels that had circulated for over a decade, accusations of sexual depravity that provided emotional justification for political murder. The crowd that gathered to watch the Queen's death had been educated by years of pornographic propaganda that portrayed her as the worthy successor to Louis XV's corruption, different in method but identical in moral decay. The irony was that abolishing the actual infrastructure of royal procurement could not eliminate the political damage that its existence had inflicted upon monarchical legitimacy. The Parc-aux-Cerfs had been closed for nearly 2 decades when Marie Antoinette mounted the scaffold. But the precedent it established, the popular resentment it had generated, and the techniques of sexual scandal it had taught to political opposition all contributed to the destruction of the dynasty that had tried to reform itself. Foreign observers noted that the French Revolution succeeded where other reform movements had failed, because it could draw upon a sophisticated popular understanding of systematic corruption that extended beyond economic grievance to moral outrage. The English ambassador reported that French revolutionaries possessed a vocabulary of institutional critique that had been developed through decades of attacking royal sexual scandal, providing them with intellectual weapons that could be turned against the entire structure of aristocratic privilege. Abolishing the brothel could not erase the stain that its existence had left upon the institution of monarchy itself. The precedent of systematic exploitation, once established, became part of popular memory that no amount of moral reformation could completely overcome. The techniques of scandal developed to attack Louis XV's genuine corruption proved equally effective against his successor's imaginary crimes. And when the guillotine finally fell on the necks of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, it was lubricated by decades of rumors, accusations, and popular resentment that traced their origins back to a modest townhouse on Rue Saint-Médéric, where teenage girls had once learned that their silence was more valuable than their virtue, and that royal pleasure was purchased with the moral authority that kept kings on their thrones. Marie Catherine sits by the window of her comfortable house in Beauvais on an autumn morning in 1793, watching smoke rise from the direction of Paris, where another batch of aristocrats has fed the revolutionary appetite for justice, disguised as vengeance. Her husband reads aloud from the newspaper about the Queen's execution, shaking his head at the moral decay that has brought such chaos to their once peaceful kingdom. He does not notice how his wife's hands tremble as she mends their daughter's stockings with thread that catches the morning light like memories of silk. She has never spoken of her years before marriage, those months that exist in her memory like a fever dream of Persian carpets and gold-framed mirrors, of tutors who taught her to curtsy and speak proper French, chambers that smelled of jasmine and orange blossom and something else she still cannot name. Her dowry purchased not just respectability but silence, a bargain that has held for over 30 years through 4 pregnancies and countless village gossip sessions where other wives speculate about royal scandal with the confidence of women who believe they understand corruption they have never experienced. The newspaper article mentions the Parc-aux-Cerfs in passing, a symbol of old regime depravity that helped justify revolutionary violence against aristocratic privilege. But the writer, like everyone else who reduced her life to political metaphor, knows nothing about the daily reality of girls who woke each morning to discover that their bodies had become property, their futures had become commodities, and their silence had become more valuable than their souls. She remembers Elise, who cried herself to sleep every night until the tears simply stopped coming. Anne-Marie, who pretended this was all an elaborate game and maintained that fiction even when the game rules became too obvious to ignore. Marguerite, who disappeared one winter night after asking too many questions about when they might return to their families. Gone without explanation, erased from memory, as if she had never existed, her name never mentioned again by the governesses, who managed their daily education in submission and silence. The truth that no pamphlet ever captured, no political speech ever acknowledged, was that the Parc-aux-Cerfs represented something larger than one king's appetites, or even one dynasty's corruption. It was a policy, a systematic approach to managing power that transformed human beings into consumable resources as deliberately as any other aspect of royal administration. The girls were not victims of individual vice, but products of institutional logic that calculated human cost against political benefit and found the arithmetic acceptable. Her own survival required forgetting not just specific incidents, but entire categories of experience that respectable society could not acknowledge. The medical examinations that reduced her to anatomical components requiring maintenance, the educational sessions that taught her to anticipate needs she had never imagined and respond to desires she was too young to understand. The constant surveillance that meant privacy existed only in the space between her thoughts, and even that felt vulnerable to inspection. The newspaper praises the revolution for ending aristocratic corruption, but Marie-Catherine understands that the system which consumed her youth and dozens of other girls possesses a logic that transcends any particular political arrangement. Power creates appetite, appetite creates demand, and demand creates markets where anything can be purchased if the price exceeds moral inhibition. The king's procurement network was merely one manifestation of dynamics that operate wherever authority concentrates sufficiently to escape accountability. The monarchy's obsession with secrecy, designed to protect royal dignity from scandal, instead destroyed the sacred aura upon which royal authority ultimately depended. Each girl recruited in darkness, each pension paid through intermediaries, each dowry provided without explanation, contributed to the growing popular suspicion that power served itself rather than the people who submitted to its authority. The attempt to hide corruption advertised its existence more effectively than confession ever could have. Marie-Catherine's daughter, now 15 and unconscious of how closely she resembles her mother at that same age, dreams of marriage to the baker's son who writes her letters. Filled with poetry copied from books his father cannot afford. She possesses innocence that her mother never experienced, confidence in her own future that speaks to profound changes in how power relates to ordinary lives. The revolution, whatever its excesses, has altered fundamental assumptions about who belongs to whom. But sitting in her comfortable parlor, surrounded by respectability purchased with coins that carry the weight of systematic exploitation, Marie-Catherine understands that her individual escape does not negate the logic that created her captivity. The infrastructure of procurement, the networks of complicity, the financial mechanisms that transform suffering into profit, all possess institutional momentum that survives political transformation. Different costumes, different justifications, but identical arithmetic that calculates human dignity against material advantage. The candles that flickered in those perfumed chambers cast shadows that still dance across her memory when sleep brings dreams she cannot entirely control. Henrik's weathered hands, she realizes, reaching across centuries of exploitation disguised as opportunity, power disguised as benevolence, systematic abuse disguised as individual choice. The girls of every generation learn the same lesson, that their silence is worth more than their testimony, their compliance more valuable than their resistance. The newspaper burns in the fireplace, its accounts of revolutionary justice consumed by flames that provide warmth, but no illumination, about the deeper structures that create the victims whose stories become political symbols before disappearing entirely from historical memory. Marie Catherine's comfortable anonymity represents both personal salvation and collective forgetting. Individual success built upon systematic erasure of the experiences that made that success necessary. Louis XV did not lose his crown to a revolution of pamphlets and rumors alone. The monarchy fell because people finally understood that their king had been buying girls like trinkets, while their families sold daughters like livestock to survive winters that grew harsher every year. The arithmetic of exploitation became impossible to hide when the cost of bread rose beyond reach, while royal account books documented continuous expenditure on luxury and silence. But the deeper truth, the one that Marie Catherine carries in her bones, if not her conscious memory, is that the king lost his divine right to rule the moment his subjects realized their silence was being purchased with their own bread, their daughters' futures, mortgaged to maintain the fiction that power serves anything other than its own appetites, and their loyalty rewarded with systematic contempt disguised as paternal care. The revolution changed governments, but not the fundamental logic that creates markets for everything that can be priced, including innocence, silence, and the futures of girls whose names disappear from history, but whose experiences echo through generations of women who learn too young that their value is determined by men who never ask their permission before calculating the cost of their cooperation. And if you stayed this far, please subscribe to the channel and watch this video next about the most inbred man in European history.